Before I start, so I'm talking about Google Apps Script. Has anyone heard of Google Apps Script before? No one? Yes, results! It means I can't bore you. Well, that's a dangerous thing to say. I could potentially bore you. My slides are online if you want to look at this afterwards. So I'm going to talk about a product that's actually been around since 2008. It's a product by Google called Google Apps Script. It's kind of been hidden in plain sight for a number of years now, and I'm trying to enlighten the developer community about this product. I don't work for Google, but I'm part of a program they have called Google Developer Experts. So it's a lot of people like you from the community, Android developers. We get corralled by Google, and we occasionally get to see some of their secrets. If you want to find out more about the Google Developers Experts, feel free to ping me afterwards. So I'm going to talk about the authenticated playground, and I'm going to do this. I've done this talk a couple of times before, and I'm going to focus it particularly for you mobile developers, how this might be a useful tool for you to be aware of and start using. Before I go further, this is my business card. This is actual size, given my job title. If you can't see that at the back, it's Chief Innovation Community and Technology Officer. It's taken me 3 years to say that without tripping over it. It probably indicates a couple of things for you there. I don't get paid much money, and I'm kind of an odd job. I do everything within our organization. And Google Apps Script is a part of that, as well as looking after many other systems. So this was quite an interesting stat I saw on Siftery, that just the number of unicorns, so businesses over 1 billion that are using Google Suite. I think there's a perception perhaps that no one's really using Google Suite, but it's 65% of the unicorns are listed as having that. So there is, if you're working with clients, there's potentially clients out there that are using Google Suite, which, as you'll see in a second, is ideal because it fits in wonderfully with Google Apps Script. So as I mentioned, Google Apps Script, it's been around since 2008. It's quite interesting that it's entirely cloud-based. So even the IDE where you type your code is in the cloud. It does lead to frustrating train journeys or flights where you can't actually do any Google Apps Scripting. A couple of years ago, they introduced plugins so you can use desktop IDEs for script development. But I think that's one of the key things to get your head around is you're writing script in the cloud, and this script runs in Google servers predominantly. You can have snippets of code that you're pinging from your applications in the cloud, there's no setup essentially, because it's all pre-baked into there. So particularly authentication is baked in. It's a Google product, and it sits within Google Drive. So that means it integrates incredibly well with Google Drive products like Documents, Sheets, and Forms, but also other Google products, so Maps, translation, and I'll show you the full list in a second. So in terms of the syntax, it's actually JavaScript. So for a lot of you developers, it's probably a syntax you're going to recognize. The thing to remember is, though, it's running in the cloud, so it's not going to have access to the DOM or anything like that, so something to be aware of. So as I mentioned, you can actually code Google Apps Script in all these products, and you can also do it as a standalone script. So for the standalone scripts, you actually do those in Google Drive. So they actually sit within your Google Drive folder, and you can search for them from in there. So as I mentioned, the beta was in 2008, and it's been going on quite a strong development arc in terms of the services that have been added into the AppScript product. So initially it was entirely based within Google Sheets, and it will just let you do custom functions. Since then it's broadened out into Documents. It's integrated into a lot of other services. And you'll see in 2016 and 15 a couple of additions to Google Apps Script were Android add-ons and execution API, which I think are where you as mobile developers will be particularly interested. So I mentioned integration was a big thing. So this is the actual script editor. It's very basic. You've got some basic debug functions. You can do versioning within here. Interestingly, it doesn't integrate within GitHub, but someone's written an extension that does that for you, so you can commit stuff if you want to do that. And one of the cool things is you have all these services already ready to go. So within a couple of lines of code, for example, you can just call up Gmail, which has its own API, but you can just call it up from here. And it's no adding libraries or anything like that, and you can start getting things from someone's inbox, from their Gmail inbox. So, for example, here's a very basic example. You can actually integrate into some of the Google Drive products. So, for example, in spreadsheets, documents, and forms, you can actually control some of the UI within those applications. So, in this example, we can just do a quick toast in the bottom corner. But you can do sidebars, you can do full dialogues. So there's a lot of customization. So obviously that's not mobile related, and I'll go into more detail about some of the mobile stuff that you can do. So I've called these one-liner services, where you can just quickly open the IDE and start typing something. So these are all the services that you'll get access to, and you don't have to worry about authentication. So everything from calendar up to spreadsheets and a number in between. There are additional Google services that you can get with a bit more setup. So these are called advanced services. So you can get things into BigQuery, or for example, you can start using the prediction API. If you're doing any sort of ad stuff, you can get into AdSense, you can get into Google Analytics. So there's interesting mashups you can do with pulling data out of Google Analytics and then doing something with your AdSense campaigns. Another feature, so those are integrations into existing Google products. Another feature of Google Apps Script is it has a number of utilities, and one of those utilities is just a very simple curl. So if an API hasn't been integrated into Google Apps Script, you can actually interact. So one of the projects I do a lot of work with is with the Twitter API. So I can do OAuth authentication into Twitter, and I interact with their recipe API and get data back. And so all this is sitting on Google servers. So I can actually, through the IDE, set up scripts to run essentially on a cron job. So the particular project I've spent most of the time on is a Google spreadsheet that just goes off every hour, collects search results, and dumps it into a Google sheet. And I don't need to be at the keyboard for that to happen. It happens 24/7. I've had scripts running for years now collecting data. So I mentioned identity. Some of those products like Google Docs, there are no APIs for you to use. But within, obviously with Google Apps Script, you do have that access. And you can also, another nice feature of Google Apps Script is actually deploy web apps. So basically deploy either your custom interfaces, or you can just deploy content services. So essentially you can make your own APIs into Google products. So if you really need to do something with documents, even though there isn't an official Google API for that, you can use AppScript to actually make your own API into those services. And you'll see here, or you probably can't see at the back, that you can actually run scripts in a number of different modes. You can run scripts so they run as yourself, or they can run as the person accessing them. And you can also run them so that the person accessing them is running them as you. So if you have parts of Google products that you want to expose to other people, that's possible. I'm going to quickly mention Google Add-ons. So I mentioned within some of the Drive products you can customize the UI. and do a lot more. Google Addons is actually allows you, there's a Google Addons store where a number of developers have created extensions to these products to extend the functionality, integrate their products into these tools. So there are a number listed there. I'm not going to go into this because it's less mobile related. When you're developing add-ons, you can actually, if you're within a Google Apps domain, so a G Suite customer, you can actually create add-ons that are just within your domain. So they don't have to be publicly accessible. So internally, if you're using Google Suite, there might be add-ons might be a route where you want to go down to get customization into Sheets, Drive, into Documents, just for your domain that gets deployed to all your employees. I mentioned Android add-ons, and I think Android add-ons are actually a bit of a red herring. So this came out last year, and basically it was a way to extend the Sheets and document apps on Android. I think it's a bit of a mess in terms of how this has been implemented. I don't think it's a very good user experience for people, but there's more documentation on that if you want to have a look. So here's a couple of screenshots from the Google Slides app on Android. Just down here, you'll see there's a menu for add-ons, and there you can go and search for add-ons within Google Play. 4 slides. There's, I think, about 9 of them right now, so not many. There's 2 here. So DocuSign has quite a good integration into Google Sheets. So, within a couple of clicks, you can send off a document from your phone signed. There's another one here I've got called AppSheet, which I think is not really doing add-ons any justice at all. It's kind of a hacky integration, and it doesn't really look nice. So if you want to see contrast of what you can do in terms of user experience, there's 2 good examples there for you. I mentioned that this was potentially a good thing for mobile developers, and one of the routes into that is something called the Execution API. So basically it allows you to expose your own personal REST interfaces into Google products. The documentation includes the client libraries that you need to do the authentication flow for users, but it just means that you could be doing stuff that previously you thought was a dead end in terms of Google products. I thought worth just covering some of the limits, and I appreciate you're not going to potentially read these, but I'm just going to pick out a couple of those. So I mentioned URL fetch. So there's quite tight quotas on URL fetch. So these quotas are based on user quotas. So user developer can develop some code that uses the execution API. And so if that execution API is running as the user, so they've authenticated against it, they're only going to get 2,000, potentially 2,000 URL fetches a day, which you'd be doing well, I think, in most cases to kill, but depending on your product, that might be a huge limit for you. I mentioned, or I may have skipped over the fact that Google Apps Script is entirely free. It's been free from the beginning. There's actually quite a few customers who are actually knocking on Google's door to say, can we actually pay for this? Because they want that kind of product level support. And I think that it is currently on a early access release. So again, URL fetch, so data quotas are something to be aware of. If you're using a lot of external APIs, you're only going to get 100 megabytes per day for a Gmail user. And that's the same if you're a G Suite customer as well. Some of these quotas will vary if you're G Suite compared to if you're just a Gmail consumer. The other two, just to highlight here, is script runtime. So you can write scripts and they have to finish execution within 6 minutes. So that's something to bear in mind if you're doing a lot of things in one go. So if you're creating files or distributing documents to a number of people, that execution has to finish within 6 minutes. And that's one of the barriers quite a lot of the developers hit into. Some clever people have come up with workarounds for this, so you can do batch processes. So when you get close to that 6 minutes, you just pause what you're doing, and then you can restart the job a minute or two later. The other one is the fetch post size, and I've hit into this one. I've got a project that integrates with GitHub, and I can't push files to GitHub that are bigger than 10 megabytes. So I thought I would try and show you an example of how this all comes together. So I'm just going to show you a very basic application that I knocked up yesterday, so hopefully it works. So the idea is you're going to have engineers going out taking meter readings or something. So we're just going to use a Google Sheet for data storage. The engineer is going to take a photo of something when they're on the site visit, and then you're going to send off a certificate to the customer with all this data put into one. So just to show you how this is set up, so this is just Google Drive, and so I've got a couple of files in here. So we've got our spreadsheet, which has just got some of our data that we're entering. We've got this template certificate, which is actually in Google Slides. And the last bit is I'm just going to show you the code. So this is the IDE. So I'm online right now. So I mentioned that Google Apps Script is server-side, but when you publish something as a web app, it allows you to do client-side stuff as well. So I've got in here 2 project files. So code is stuff that's basically going to execute on the server. And then we've got index, which is basically some HTML markup. So when Google initially released this ability to publish HTML services, they did a lot of sanitization on the HTML. There's no restrictions now, so you can plug in HTML5 stuff and it runs okay. Within here, we've actually got a mixture of JavaScript, so there's hopefully some functions that you'll recognize here. This function is actually how we do an Ajax-like call back to the server, and I'll show you where that happens in a second. We can also kind of integrate, so these are AppScript scriptlets, so we can actually do stuff. We can inject data.
Sorry, can you zoom a little bit, buddy?
Sure. So we can actually do get stuff from the server and inject it into our file. So I'll just quickly show you. So here you can see we can actually deploy this in a number of ways. So I mentioned this is how you deploy it as an execution API. You can deploy stuff to the Chrome Web Store. You can deploy stuff as an add-on, an Android add-on. And the one I'm going to show you is as a web app. So we can actually version this stuff as well. So we can basically work on a development version. When we're happy, we can push that code. It's a bit limited, but that's what we've got. So here I'm actually showing you or setting how this app is executed. So basically it's going to execute as the person at the keyboard who's using the web app. And the last one here is who has access. If I change the top one, I'll get different options there. So if I jump over to here and zoom, So this, you probably won't see it, but this is actually this index file published and running. It runs on Google servers. Unfortunately, you probably can't see it, but it's got a very messy URL. And there is an issue ticket to allow people to customize this URL so that it can be mapped to their domain. That hasn't happened yet. So basically our index file is rendered as a form. So I've got different fields in here. So we can actually access the query string as well within our apps. So we can pull back different information. So the location ID just updated there. So I'm just going to quickly grab a photo and submit this. So now it's interacting with the server, and this is where you see some of the performance issues with AppScript. It's not the fastest service in the world, so something to bear in mind. So it said it's sent now. So what's actually happened is if I go to my inbox, you'll see I now have a PDF that's been filled in and emailed to me. So just to show you how that's happening on the server side, there's a couple of things that we set up. So on the server, we basically say that we're running a HTML service. We can actually pass data into that HTML service. So for example, if I want to open up a spreadsheet and get all the values, it's a couple of lines of code there. And so other highlights would be, let me just scroll down. So for example, that image that it was just a file field within the form. To push that into Google Drive, again, it's 3 lines of code. So we're not doing a huge amount of setup. So where I use AppScript the most personally is for quick solutions within our organization. So if I need something quick to set up, AppScript is usually the tool I turn to. Again, setting data to spreadsheets, you can do that in a couple lines of code. Doing stuff with slides is a bit more advanced. There isn't actually a slide service within AppScript, but we just interact with the slides API, which was recently released. So we're basically getting the template slide, we're making a copy of it, and we're renaming it within those couple of lines. And then we can do things like image and text. And then this is the cool one for me, to turn it into a PDF is get as PDF. And we have a mail app service, so we can quickly just send off the email. So it doesn't take much code to do stuff. I really appreciate it's a bit of a Mickey Mouse example, but hopefully you get the idea of what's possible. And I think that just goes through some of the code. Oh yeah, the last thing is just to show you the authentication flow with. So I've hit this URL for the first time. And what it's asking me to do is review the permissions. So I'm already logged in with my Google account, and we get the usual, or you're probably familiar with these if you're using some services that integrate with Google products. You're asked for permission. It's quite a scary list, and I appreciate you probably have similar issues when you're doing mobile development, that within AppScript the scoping isn't particularly tight. So that's one of the issues for end users, is it's quite a, you want me to do what? You want me to view and manage files in your Google Drive. That's it, you can't limit it to a folder or anything like that. And this is a one-time authentication. Once I've hit this once, every time I come back to this web app, it's gonna, and I'm logged into my Google account, it's not gonna ask for those authentication credentials again. So it's slick on that front. And I think that's me.